there's a sort of general agreement about who should be attacked. And they're all people who are seeking power of one kind or another. So we are going to bash you.
Right, let's see how that goes. He's his own worst enemy. On his day, he's worth every penny of the 8.5 million. Right?
Yeah.
But he's got a fatal flaw like...
I think an obsession with boredom is a peculiarly English satirical tradition. If you look at something like Pope's Dunciad, it is a long catalogue of men Pope found boring. Booksellers, other playwrights, the poet laureate, anyone who irritated him, in they went as bores. The whole thing ends with a vast yawn. I mean, it's basically a great bores of today, of 200 years ago.
You see, once the knee goes, you've had it. It's the only joint that goes one way. Two goes.
Once the knees...
Once you've, yeah.
Done your knee.
Once you've done your knee.
Done your knee.
Yeah.
Once you've done your knee.
You've had it. It's the only joint that goes one way. With this keyhole surgery, they can do miracles, but I still...
Peter Cook's confidence in me, I think, seemed rather perversely persistent. He kept needling Richard Ingrams to allow me to write a comic strip. He introduced me to a New Zealand artist called Nick Garland. Peter wanted a comic strip about an Australian abroad, and the name Barry McKenzie was proposed. Rather a kind of early version of Crocodile Dundee, which owes a lot to Barry McKenzie. In fact, it's a very amiable plagiarization, I think, of Barry McKenzie, with crocodiles added. By the end of the 1960s, of course, it was a tremendous cult. But in the end, I think he felt that I'd overstepped the mark a bit. Lurking in the atmosphere of that office was an innate conservatism, one felt. Everyone was pretty middle class and fundamentally rather puritanical. This was the paradox, of course, of Richard Ingrams. There was a scene, I think, between lesbians in a dentist's chair, which I think genuinely offended Richard Ingrams.
He goes everywhere that I go, whether sleeping or awake. God help me if I ever lost me little one-eyed trouser snake.
It was more of a kind of schoolboy sex joke that appealed to them. Not the kind of grown-up stuff that I went in for in Barry McKenzie. You know, I just think it was the wrong brand of filth for them.
As a doctor, I am often asked, Doctor, have you been spanking young women in your surgery? The simple answer is yes. What happens is this. The patient comes to the doctor with a problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11.5 wonderful years.
Well, number 10 is a house and a home.
Yeah, Bill. So, doing the move. I think the idea about being home all day and then we'll get on with the move.
Yeah, okay.
By having the little woman.
Well, getting in my way.
Hanging about the house all day.
While I'm trying to work the microwave.
While I'm trying to work the microwave.
Dear Bill, thank you for your condolences on the safe return of the Son and H from his Sahara car rally. Honestly, what a prized twerp. I washed my hands of the little blighter years ago, and when the boss told me he was intending to drive across the desert with some fancy French bint he'd picked up in the pits, my response was, you go to hell in a handcart for all I count. Next thing I know, Emmy's hammering on my door at some unearthly hour to say she's just heard on the Jimmy Young programme that the little bugger's been missing for 4 days, and what was I going to do about it?
Every week, Dave Spart, General Secretary of the National Amalgamated Union of Sixth Form Operatives and Allied Trades and editor of The Strike, talks frankly and outspokenly about the facts behind the news.
The events of recent weeks have shown quite clearly that, as Marx predicted over 100 years ago, the crisis implicit in the whole nature of the capitalist system is, i.e., this is it.
I think the general political approach of Private Eye has been extraordinarily conventional, leftish in the 60s. Well, you say hostile to the Wilson government, but from the left.
Mr. Mogg, the kind, bespectacled former clergyman with the unfortunate speech impediment who edits the Times, rang in person to ask if it was true that Harold was a martyr to terminal flatulence.
Groceries, cover up those awful teeth. Oh no.
In the beginning of the 70s, they went for the right. They moved very much against the Heath government as the thing began to change in the 70s. So you find, if you like, the Thatcherite revolution affected Private Eye. And I think, as a matter of fact, my old friend Richard Ingrams.
These notes were all belted up.
I'm certain, because he's disclosed this to me, and I pass it on with great relish. I mean, I think he voted Labour, but I know he voted for Harold Wilson's, you know, in 1964-70, and probably in 1974, but I think, you know, during 79, 83 and 87, he voted for Mrs. Thatcher.
Typical upper-class fellow, very tall, and, you know, like stunted working-class people like ourselves. And he got nominated for the most romantic member of Parliament by his secretary, whom he sacked. Married this woman, and has now divorced her. Typical Tory. Pushing her.
There was some sort of serious support for some of Mrs. Thatcher, particularly from me, I have to say. I mean, I was quite keen on Mrs. Thatcher. And that's one of the nice things about the last 10 years, was the way that one kind of argued this out. It never stands in the way, really, of being able to make jokes.
The Eye can campaign in a way because it has some jokes in it and because there are other reasons for reading it. If you look at the stories of the Gibraltar killings and the subsequent government and press cover-up, Piper Alpha, the Zeebrugge ferry disaster, Colin Wallace, the follow-up to the Birmingham and Guildford Six. I mean, it's been a fairly solid run.
I think the stuff I would look back on, which I was proudest of, was done when I was working there full-time. We started to write about the collapse of the tower block, Ronan Point. We did attacks on polluters of every description, the Poulsen corruption scandal in 1970, which I suppose is probably the best article I ever wrote for Private Eye, which was 3 pages long. Nobody paid the slightest attention. I mean, it was just like dropping a stone in the sea. No one noticed anything about it. It was only about 2 years later, when he went bankrupt and it all became public, that everyone regarded as the great corruption scandal. And people still ring up now and say, I've got a scandal which will make the Poulsen scandal look like a tea party. Of course, you always know then that they haven't got a scandal when they brag about a thing like that in the first place.
What really was contributed by me and Peter Mackay to Private Eye was rarefied stories about the rich and famous, the powerful and the privileged. People who bought Private Eye suddenly were vaulted into the drawing rooms and the baronial keeps of the mighty, and they were getting stories about Princess Margaret, whom I knew well, and other members of the royal family, which were obviously unprintable in newspapers. Normally they were slightly sexually oriented. We started the Shit of the Year competition, which gave me an enormous amount of leverage to use terrible stories about people. Ingrams was the guiding light in this new world of getting sophistication and the upper classes, so to call, the royalty into Private Eye, because it genuinely intrigued him. I think it was his grandfather or great-grandfather was Queen Victoria's physician, and that was his only brief relationship with the people who his wife always wanted to mix with. His wife's an Irish landed gentry, a bit of a snob, or enormous snob, in fact.
When I became editor,